All right, so looking at the screen, you can see the essential question for this section of French and Indian War. This is a very short set of notes, but the French and Indian War is also known as the 7 Years' War. This is what takes place primarily in Europe between two countries, and then it spreads to the colonies. Looking at the cartoon at the bottom, what you're going to notice about that cartoon is that, first of all, you'll notice that you can see that there are names drawn on each part of the snake. And the idea is that each one of these then represents a different set of colonies or a colony. And the information here, it says, look, we've got to get together, join, or we're all going to die. We need to unite. This was actually formulated by Ben Franklin. He was the one that designed this and was trying to communicate the idea that, look, at this time in this particular war, it is important that we join or we're all going to die. Now, the war itself, just so you can see, is actually between the British and the French. It's not between the French and the Indians. This was something that was described by the colonists, that this is the French and Indians are the ones that are attacking us. The entire thing, though, is really French and Indians versus the British and the colonists, which are essentially Englishmen themselves. So the question here in the center, what issues will a country have to deal with after a war, even if it wins the war? So focus as we're thinking about this, and you're not going to find the answer to this question directly in the notes. You're going to find it more so. Just think about wars in general, what has to happen after a war, and what kind of issues does a country have to deal with? Because at the end of this war, our country is going to have to deal with something. The colonists are going to have to deal with the situation when it's all over. So first, let's look at the causes of the war. Causes of the war are fairly simple. Again, the war starts in Europe, and then it begins to spread to the colonies. And it's all about a piece of territory that is west of the Appalachian Mountains, known as the Ohio River Valley. This piece of land is a very valuable piece of land to the French. They were using it at the time primarily for fur trapping of beavers. But the Ohio River Valley is something that for a long time the English really sort of thought of as their own. It turns out that you look at some of the older maps of the colonies, you'll see that Virginia and other colonies claimed parts of the Ohio Valley, and so there was a great disagreement over that land and who owned it in the first place. The people that lived in the colonies thought of this piece of land as very valuable, perhaps even as valuable as all of Britain or all of France in terms of the natural resources. And again, why? Well, first and foremost, it has to do with the beaver that lived there. And those animals, of course, are very valuable primarily to the French, but this area has something else going for it. If you'll notice, the area sits in a place that is where the Ohio River kind of goes through the middle of it. This is the Mississippi over here, Mississippi River. But this is a low part. This area is a low part, a low area in the geography. Obviously, from the mountains, it slopes down this way. Obviously, if this was low here near the Great Lakes would be much larger and would occupy this area, so it must slope down this way. So a lot of rivers flow into this area, and with all that watershed, with all that water moving in there, this area is highly populated by beavers, and along this area too by beavers, and that's the reason why the French are there. But the British want that area for farming, and they want to be able to take their colonies and spread the people from the colonies into this area and begin settling it. And so, again, the ORV, the Ohio River Valley, is the focus of this conflict. Now, the reason why we talk about it is because at the end of it, what happens is the British are going to have to make some very hard decisions about their colonies when the war is over. But the other reason is because George Washington is an instrumental person in this war. And of course, knowing something about George Washington later on, that he becomes a general during the Revolution, that he becomes President of the United States, we obviously need to know how he is affected by this war and what that experience, how that experience is going to affect his decision making in the future. So it's during this war that he gets his military experience. He really isn't a person with any kind of military experience prior to this. As a matter of fact, he tried to get into the Redcoats, but he had a hard time doing that. They would not let him in because he was not an English-born person. He was somebody who was born in the colonies, and so they really didn't see him as a person that could be a Redcoat officer. Instead, they wanted him to be a lesser person in the military, somebody who would obviously be taking orders rather than giving them. And so what he decides to do is use his money and influence and to create his own militia and his own citizen army. And this was very common at the time. Most colonies had their own militias. They used that for protection against the Indians primarily. They use it as their only form of protection for their colony. They didn't really have police forces as we understand them today, so the militia functioned in that way. It was also sort of a club in the sense that the people that were in it were very close. They spent a lot of time together. They spent a lot of time socially together. And so this was a very tight-knit group. He's going to buy the materials, the uniforms for his militia. He's going to train them with whatever little training he has. And the result is he's going to take that Virginia militia now, and under the guidance of the British, he's going to use that small army along with the British soldiers and to attack the French and the Indians in the Ohio River Valley. The war doesn't go well for the British at first, and the primary reason, George Washington notes, is that because there's a problem with the way the British fight. They struggle because of their tactics, primarily. They also struggle because of a lack of supplies, at least early in the war, and a lack of men. But the main reason, he says, is because of the fact that they are walking through the forest dressed in these bright-colored clothes, and it makes them very much obvious to the Indians. They stand out. And the Indians, on the other hand, they aren't doing that. The Indians are using, we wouldn't call it camouflage at the time, but essentially it is camouflage. The Indians are going to blend in. They are going to be sort of hidden in the bushes because they're going to wear things that are more naturally natural in terms of their coloration. And the result is that they're harder to see. So unlike the Indians, the British are easy targets, whereas the Indians are more difficult targets. Washington also notices that the British are using a very old form of warfare. They still line up shoulder to shoulder, and they tend to march into a battle together. They tend to shoot together still, while the Indians are going to use a very different tactic. The Indians are not opposed to hiding. They're not opposed to running. They're not opposed to hiding behind things, waiting in surprise to jump out and attack the British soldiers. They're using a form of what we call guerrilla warfare. And this is something that the British are very much unused to. And Washington notices that between these two things, the British army is struggling horribly to really combat the Indians. Now, they're fighting mostly the Indians. It's not as much the French, and that's because the French have armed the Indians from Canada, and the Indians are the ones doing most of the fighting, at least in the Ohio River Valley. There are other battles that take place further north, up into sort of along the Canadian border and into Canada, where the British are fighting the French directly, but most of the battles within the colonies take place against the Indians. When the war is all over, the British have taken over North America. The French have lost most of their land. We can say safely it's 99% or something very close to that, because they're going to be left with a very small piece when it's all said and done. And that means that Britain gains control of all the land in North America, and the U.S. and Canada from the East Coast all the way to the Mississippi River. So on a map, what this looks like is this. The area you see here that is labeled British colonies, and the area that is labeled up here is in the orange also around the Hudson Bay, those areas are owned by the British. Well, at the end of the war, the area that is now owned by the British includes all this green area becomes British. And you notice that word behind there, it says ceded. The word ceded means literally that this land was given to the British. At the end of the war and the Treaty of Paris, the land is given. But now look how large the territory is that Britain owns. It is everything from the East Coast all the way to the Mississippi River and all the way into Canada. And notice how it stretches all the way over here in Canada. Not that there's any British over there, but they're going to claim that land, that direction. Now this piece of land called New France, France retains this after the war, but you'll notice here it says they very quickly sell it. I mean, who wants this piece of land stuck in the middle of this country, surrounded on one side by Spain and the other side by the British, with a very little opening here to the ocean? This becomes very much useless to the French. They sell it to Spain, and then the Spanish territory is going to become massive as well. This whole area becomes Spanish. And so really we have two countries now that are going to dominate North America, the British and the Spanish. And notice that the Spanish also own Florida, of course. That hasn't changed. And most of the Caribbean islands. France is then left with this little bitty island down here, Haiti. That's all they have left. And at this point in the history of the United States, the British are in complete control of the continent, and the eastern part of the continent, the western part of the continent, is still under Spanish control. And then over time what's going to happen is, of course, with the American Revolution, we're going to have this territory that is here in the center. This territory is going to become under American control, and the British will still maintain control over Canada. But that has to occur, of course, not until after the American Revolution.